Morning, everyone. The reading this morning is from Ruth 1 to 10. Boaz redeems Ruth. Now Boaz went up to the gate and sat down there, and behold, the close relative of whom Boaz had spoken came by. So Boaz said, "Come aside, friend, sit down here." So he came aside and sat down, and he took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, "Sit down here." So they sat down. Then he said to the close relative, Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, sold the piece of land which belonged to our brother Elimelech, and I thought to inform you, saying, "Buy it back in the presence of the inhabitants and the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not redeem it, then tell me, that I may know, for there is no one but you to redeem it, and I am next after you." And he said, "I will redeem it." Then Boaz said, on the day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you must also buy it from Ruth the Moabite, the wife of the dead, to perpetuate the name of the dead through her inheritance. And the close relative said, "I cannot redeem it for myself, unless I ruin my own inheritance. You redeem my right of redemption for yourself, for I cannot redeem it." Now this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging to conform everything. One man took off his sandal and gave it to the other, and this was a confirmation in Israel. Therefore the close relative said to Boaz, "Buy it for yourself." So he took off his sandal, and Boaz said to the elders and all the people, "You are witness this day that I have bought all that was Elimelech's and all that was Chilion's and Mahlon's from the hand of Naomi. And moreover, Ruth the Moabite, the widow of Mahlon, I have acquired as for my wife, to perpetuate the name of the deed through his inheritance, that the name of the deed may not be cut off from any among his brethren. And from this position at the gate you are witness this day." Amen.
We're coming to the end of our series on the book of Ruth. And I don't know about you, but personally, I've really enjoyed looking at it and studying it in depth and thinking about it, and I've learnt so much. But the one question we've got to ask is, what's the lesson of this book? What main thing does the author, and we don't actually know who wrote it, want us to take away from the reading of the story of Ruth? Well, it could be, if we think about it, from emptiness to fullness. And that is not a straight line, but the characters involved do get there in the end. So the story of Ruth, as we know by now, it's a series of setbacks. In chapter 1, Naomi, her husband and 2 sons, leave their home in Judah on account of a famine. Then Elimelech dies. Her sons marry Moabite women, and for 10 years both women prove to be barren. Then her sons die, leaving Naomi with 2 widows. Even though Ruth clings to Naomi, chapter 1 ends with Naomi's bitter complaint, "I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. The Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me." In chapter 2, Naomi is filled with a new hope because Boaz has appeared on the scene as a possible husband for Ruth. But he doesn't propose to Ruth. He doesn't make any moves. At least that is the way it seems at first. So the chapter closes brimming with excited hope, but also suspense and uncertainty about how this is all going to work out. The last time I shared was chapter 3. Naomi and Ruth made this risky move in the middle of the night. Ruth goes to Boaz on the threshing floor and says, in effect, I want you to spread your wing over me as my husband. But right when the tragedy of Ruth's widowhood seems to be resolved in a beautiful love story, there is, as is often the case, a complication. There is another man who, according to Jewish custom, has prior claim to marry Ruth. The impeccably honest Boaz will not proceed without giving this man his lawful opportunity. So chapter 3 again ends in suspense of another setback. And we've heard part of chapter 4 being read to us this morning. So we're going to start with the resolution at the gates. Because there was a private conversation which Ruth had with Boaz on the threshing floor. And now the scene has moved to a very public sphere. And in that public sphere, Ruth and Naomi are voiceless and powerless. Boaz becomes their voice. Now he is a man of strength, of noble character, and of great standing in the community. However, rather than bullying others to get his way, Boaz acts with wisdom. Boaz trusts in God's hesed. Now, that was a brand new word to me. That's like, wow. I'd never heard of the word, never seen it in my life before. But I was studying it and reading up all about it in Ruth 4. And I looked up what the word meant, hesed. This is a real school teacher thing, I know, I can't help it, but you spell it H-E-S-E-D, hesed. Okay, so I looked up on Mr. Google what it meant, and it means something. It's like this. Hesed is difficult to translate. No single word in English captures its meanings. Translators use words like kindness, loving kindness, mercy, loyalty. Perhaps loyal love is close. But hesed is one of the richest, most powerful words in the Old Testament. It reflects the loyal love that people committed to the God of the Bible should have for one another. It is not a mood. Hesed is not primarily something that people feel. It is something people do for other people who have no claim on them. The word hesed is displayed throughout the story of Ruth, where it's usually translated as kindness. And love is something we do, not always something we feel. Naomi uses this word of Ruth in chapter 1, verse 8. The Lord deal kindly with you. Naomi uses this word of Boaz to explain his lavish act of kindness in Ruth 2:20. Blessed be he of the Lord who did not withhold his kindness. Boaz uses this word of Ruth in Ruth chapter 10 verse 3. The Lord bless you, my daughter. This kindness, this hesed, is greater than what you showed earlier. Well, what happened earlier we know. Ruth did not forsake Naomi, and she gleaned to provide for their needs. It was more than kindness, it was a loyalty to her mother-in-law. And in proposing to Boaz, she showed her further regard for family relationships. Now, when she thought of marriage, she didn't go after young men as she could have. And Boaz implies that had she wanted to, she could have married a wealthy younger man. Now, just stop there for a minute and think. Can you think of examples of someone who showed hesed, kindness, someone else to you, or did you show it to someone else? Now, I couldn't stop there, guys. Honestly, I got so much into this hesed word that I just want to share this with you too. Two more sharings, because this is the basis of the story of Ruth. God's hesed, God's unfailing love. So this is called 12 Ways God's Loving Kindness is for You. First of all, Hesed is way more than kindness, because no single English word can adequately encompass Hesed. The Bible translates it as love, kindness, loving kindness, goodness, favour, mercy, faithful love, steadfast love, unfailing kindness. And as we read the Bible, we need to remember that God's Hesed is all of those words. God's Hesed is who God is. God's loving kindness is part of his character. And because of that, it never changes. His loving kindness is never less one day and more the next. And we can only know Hesed by knowing God. Hesed is not a passive feeling, but proactive faithfulness. It's not an emotion or a mood, but God's faithful love in action. Hesed is undeserved kindness from one in power to one who is weak. God bends down to give unmerited kindness to us in our weakness. And God's Hesed never depends on whether we're good enough. We can never go where God's Hesed, his loving kindness, is not. God's Hesed is unfailing. It is faithful when we are faithless. And this day, right now, God's Hesed for you is at work. We can never reach the limit of God's Hesed. That is why the Bible describes God's Hesed as abounding and abundant. It is generous and limitless, and it is sufficient for each one of us. We're saved because of God's Hesed. Why did Christ die for sinners? Not because we deserved it, but because of his great love. And I just want to share this beautiful verse. It's not because of it's because of the Lord's great love, or Hesed, we are not consumed, for his compassions never fail. Lamentations 3:22. We're sustained in suffering by God's Hesed. God's Hesed, his steadfast love, doesn't give us a pass on suffering. Rather, it holds us in suffering. And even in difficulties, we can see signs of God's goodness around us. We're to glorify God for his Hesed. How can we stay silent? God's love, his loving kindness, his Hesed gives us deliverance, redemption, relationship, guidance, forgiveness, hope and security. We are called to tell others about God's love. How can we keep it to ourselves? And the last, and we're going to talk about this again a bit later, but we're called to show Hesed. God tells us to imitate Christ as beloved children. He has shown you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly and show mercy, Hesed, and walk humbly with your God. What God pours into us, we are to pour into others. That's powerful. You know, if you took one of those things and really thought about it and prayed about it and took it into your heart, man, it's big stuff. And then, because I was into this kindness thing, and of course I had to smile to myself because Jacinda's into kindness, isn't she? She often says, you see her on telly, she says, you know, we've got a kindness thing. And it's great, it's right, because how much kindness is there in the world? But kindness changes everything. True kindness, if we're thinking of kindness now, true kindness is spirit-produced. Galatians 5:22. And we are to imitate God's kindness by loving our enemies. Jesus said, love your enemies and do good and lend, expecting nothing in return, and your reward will be great, and you will be the sons of the Most High. For he is kind to the ungrateful and evil. Luke 6:35. Our kindness reflects the heart of our Father. Be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, as God in Christ forgave you. Ephesians 4:32. And I really wanted to share this because I think it was just like an interesting little aside. It's headed up, kindness is powerful. In her memoir about the journey from being a committed lesbian to a committed Christian, Rosaria Butterfield says that as a non-Christian, her impression of evangelical Christians was that they were poor thinkers, judgmental, scornful, and afraid of diversity. After publishing a critique of an evangelical Christian group in her local newspaper, she received an enormous volume of polarised responses. Placing an empty box in each corner of her desk, she sorted hate mail into one and fan mail into the other. Then she received a 2-page response from a local pastor. It was a kind and inquiring letter, she said. It had warmth and civility in it, in addition to its probing questions. She couldn't figure out which box to put the letter in, so it sat on her desk for 7 days. It was the kindest letter of opposition that I'd ever received. Its tone demonstrated that the writer wasn't against her. Eventually, she contacted the pastor and became friends with him and his wife. They talked with me in a way that didn't make me feel erased. Their friendship was an important part of her journey to faith. That is powerful. I'm just going to leave that bit there. And we're going to go back to our story of Ruth. I just wanted to share that Hesed word because it's really something that has impacted on me. So Boaz goes to the city gate where the official business is done. And we've just said Naomi and Ruth are totally powerless. They cannot open their mouths. For some of us women, me included, that might have been difficult because you can't say a word. Zip the lip. The men have all the say. So, the nearer kinsman comes by and Boaz lays the situation before him. Naomi is giving up what little property she has, and the duty of the nearest kinsman is to buy it so that the inheritance stays in the family. Now, to our dismay, the kinsman says at the end of verse 4, I will redeem it. We don't want him to redeem it. We want Boaz to do it. So again, it's a bit of a setback. And the irony of this setback is that it's being caused by righteousness. This fellow was only doing his duty. At this point, we're saying, oh no, stop the story. Don't let this fellow take Ruth. Don't let it happen. However, Boaz has a plan. Boaz reminds him, on the day you buy the land from Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the dead man's widow. That's Ruth chapter 4, verse 5. Now notice how Boaz presents Ruth. To this point, Boaz has spoken of Ruth with much admiration and praise. Her demonstration of Hesed towards Naomi is noteworthy, and she's described as a woman of noble character, one whom any Israelite male would be blessed to marry. But here, Boaz introduces her as the Moabite, a foreigner who belongs to one of Israel's most hated enemy kingdom. And she's also described as the dead man's widow, not only a foreigner, and although not explicitly said, also childless. Presented this way, Ruth is not a desirable partner, but a financial liability. Phew! To our great relief, the kinsman says in verse 6, I can't do it. Now, in the public sphere, Boaz forced the hand of the nameless relative, we don't know his name, by means of what seems to have been a formalised ritual. The relative transfers all the rights to Boaz. Now, this transfer was made official with an item of clothing, offering of clothing. And here at the gate, the piece of clothing is a sandal. And I thought, that's a bit weird. You know, you've got two sandals on your feet and suddenly you've only got one because you've handed one over, and that's the deal. It's like, you know, there used to be, Warwick always says, it used to be in the good old days that a man's word was his bond and that you shook on it and that was it. And I guess in the old days it was like that. You didn't sign contracts, you didn't do this, you shook his hand and his word was his bond. Well, here you whip off your sandal and the deed's done. So I found this following information really interesting. Removing a sandal was a symbolic act that signalled a change of status. Now, when people expressed pain, they would tear their clothing and change into rough clothing, which would symbolise their low emotional state. When women became widows, such as Naomi and Ruth, they would wear clothing that reflected this new social status. But before going to see Boaz, do you remember what Naomi told Ruth to do? She told her to change out of her clothing, put your good clothes on. Probably said, have a shower, get, whatever. But get into some good clothes. Change your clothing to indicate that you've got a new status as one who is open to marriage. And Boaz subsequently covered Ruth as a symbol for marriage. And so we know that there is a great ending to our story. Boaz married Ruth, and the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. Ruth 4:13. Now, this is a story of redemption through Hesed, God's loving kindness. God could have done wonders with Naomi and Ruth. He could have come to them in an awesome storm and talked to them, just like he did with Job. He could have sent a powerful prophet, as he did with the widow of Zarephath and the prophet Elijah, but he didn't. Instead, and we've got to think about this because we've been right through those chapters, all through, God was quietly working behind the scenes. God allowed his people to represent him. Boaz's Hesed represented God's Hesed. Boaz's loving, compassionate, courageous and righteous actions represented God. And Ruth's own courageous, loving, daring and loyal actions show us how to seek the kingdom of God and his righteousness. Ruth becomes a model of what Hesed, loving kindness, looks like, not just for women, but for all of God's people. We notice too that Naomi is no longer bitter and empty. Her identity has changed radically. Ruth's identity has equally changed because she's no longer a foreign widow. She's now married to a man of noble character, and she's a mother. And she's been compared to great women of Israel like Rachel and Leah and Tamar, and that's Ruth 4:12. Ruth is now an Israelite woman, a woman of noble character, the mother of Obed. Now, Obed was the ancestor of the great King David. And eventually, if you look in Matthew 1:5-16, you'll see the lineage of Jesus. And Ruth's name is mentioned in that lineage, because she had Obed, and Obed was an ancestor of King David, and so it comes through. Now, what are we going to take away from all this? John 13:34 says, "A new commandment I give you. Love one another. As I have loved you, you must love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you have love one for another. God's hesed, his loving kindness, transforms and renews people. The best is yet to come. Amen.